My name is Sergeant First Class Elias Thorne, and after 15 years of bleeding for a country that doesn't know my name, I returned home to find that my own sister had replaced my existence with a decorative Buddha statue and a lavender-scented lies. I am 37 years old, a retired Army Ranger with 2 titanium plates in my left tibia and a cumulative debt of sacrifice that no pension could ever truly repay. But I am getting ahead of myself. Now let me take you back to the moment the gravel of 42 Pineview Terrace crunched under my boots for the first time since the surge. The house was a colonial-style build in the suburbs of Greenwich, Connecticut, a property currently valued at approximately $1.2 million, which my parents had left to both of us in a will that Monica had apparently decided was merely a suggestion. I stood on the porch, my hands calloused and shaking slightly from the nerve damage sustained during my final deployment in the Helmand province, clutching a single olive-drab tactical duffel bag and a tarnished brass key that felt like a relic from a dead civilization. I expected the smell of my mother's cinnamon candles. Instead, the air was thick with the cloying, expensive scent of Santal 33 and high-end essential oils. Before I could even fit the key into the Baldwin deadbolt, the door swung open to reveal Monica. She didn't hug me. She didn't weep. She stood there in a pair of $78 Lululemon Align leggings and a matching sports bra, holding a glass of green juice that probably cost more than my daily meal allowance in the field. Monica, who had rebranded herself as a spiritual manifestation coach charging $150 per 45-minute private Zoom session, looked at my uniform with a mixture of pity and profound irritation. She didn't see a brother who had survived 5 deployments and 2 reconstructive surgeries. She saw a chaotic energy threatening her curated sanctuary. She blocked the threshold with her lean, toned frame, her hand resting on the doorframe as if to prevent a breach by an insurgent. She told me without a hint of irony that the house was now her sacred healing studio and that my presence was a vibration she hadn't yet integrated into her vision board. The home I grew up in, where I had carved my initials into the baseboards of the pantry, had been gutted. The warm oak floors were covered in cork yoga mats and expensive meditation bolsters from Restoration Hardware. She didn't offer me my old room, the one with the posters of the 10th Mountain Division and my high school track medals. No, that had been converted into her primary filming suite, complete with a $500 ring light and a minimalist desk. Instead, she led me like a stray dog to a cramped 90-square-foot guest room at the back of the house, right next to the noisy HVAC unit. The space was suffocating, filled with the dusty remnants of her daughter's glory days, gold-painted plastic gymnastics trophies from 2014 and boxes of discarded leotards. There was barely enough room for my twin-sized cot, let alone the weight of my memories. As I dropped my bag onto the thin, polyester rug, the sound of the metal buckles hitting the floor seemed to offend her. She reminded me that she had a client arriving in 20 minutes for a soul alignment session, and that I needed to keep my heavy footsteps to a minimum because the floorboards were sensitive. I looked at my sister, a woman who spoke of universal love and empathy, and realized that to her, I was just a piece of broken machinery that didn't fit the aesthetic of her brand new life. I was home, but for the first time in 15 years, I felt more behind enemy lines than I ever did in the mountains of Afghanistan. Walking through the hallways of 42 Pineview Terrace felt like navigating a high-end boutique hotel where I was the only unwanted guest, as every trace of our parents' 30-year legacy had been systematically purged and replaced by the hollow aesthetics of Monica's spiritual brand. The sturdy mahogany sideboard where my father used to keep his collection of National Geographic magazines had been tossed out for a minimalist reclaimed wood console topped with $45 Himalayan salt lamps that cast a sickly, orange glow over the foyer. Even the air felt different, stripped of the scent of home-cooked meals and replaced by the sterile, medicinal heat of a $300 portable infrared sauna she had installed in what used to be our breakfast nook. I stood in the kitchen, staring at a smart refrigerator that cost more than my first car, only to have Monica slide a printed document across the marble-topped island with the clinical detachment of a corporate liquidator. She didn't ask if I had enough money for groceries or how my physical therapy was progressing. Instead, she outlined a mandatory financial contribution plan that required me to send her $1,200 every month via Venmo. It was a staggering demand for a cramped 90-square-foot room in a house our parents had fully paid off in 1998, a property that was supposed to be our shared sanctuary. Monica justified the cost by calling it a market-rate wellness surcharge, claiming that my heavy energy required her to perform extra sage smudging rituals to maintain the house's high vibrational frequency. She tracked my every movement like a hawk monitoring a target through a thermal scope, documenting my resource consumption with a level of scrutiny that would have made a drill sergeant blush. Living under her roof was like being back in a high-security barracks, but without the camaraderie or the clear chain of command. If I dared to use the 1100-watt Panasonic microwave after 9 p.m. to heat up a cup of tea for my chronic nerve pain, she would appear in the doorway of her silk robe to complain that the electromagnetic interference was disrupting her circadian rhythm and the sleep of her daughter. She even went so far as to install a smart water meter on the shower head in the hallway bathroom, sending me a screenshot of a spreadsheet every Sunday to point out that I had exceeded my 3-gallon per shower limit. She spoke about the sanctity of the Earth's resources while charging her 6-figure Tesla Model Y in the garage, oblivious to the hypocrisy of charging her wounded brother rent for his own childhood home. The contrast between her public persona of universal empathy and the cold, transactional nature of our daily interactions was a jagged pill to swallow. Every time I heard the ding of a Venmo notification on my phone, I felt a fresh wave of indignation rising in my chest, a reminder that to Monica I wasn't a hero or a brother, but a line item on a balance sheet that needed to be managed. I sat on the edge of that narrow cot in the guest room, surrounded by dusty trophies and the hum of the HVAC unit, realizing that the sister I once protected had become a stranger who measured love in kilowatts and gallons. I was paying $1,200 a month to be a ghost in my own life, watching as she sold off the remnants of our family's history to make room for more overpriced crystals and spiritual theater. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday morning that smelled of expensive roasted beans and the sharp, acidic tang of cold-pressed lime. I was sitting at the Carrara marble kitchen island, a surface that cost $4,000 of our parents' inheritance, watching Monica meticulously assemble a $14 avocado toast on artisanal sourdough, topped with microgreens and 22-karat gold-infused sea salt. Her 17-year-old daughter Sophie sat across from me, her eyes glued to her iPhone 15 Pro Max, completely desensitized to the domestic Cold War unfolding in her peripheral vision. Monica didn't offer me a plate. Instead, she adjusted the lighting for an Instagram story before turning her clinical, judgmental gaze toward me. With a voice as smooth and cold as a river stone, she labeled me a freeloading soldier in front of her child, her words cutting deeper than the shrapnel that had shredded my thigh in Kandahar. She claimed that my 15 years of service, my 5 deployments, and the 2 major surgeries that left me with a permanent limp didn't entitle me to royalty treatment or a free ride in her house. The irony was a physical weight in the room, considering the house at 42 Pineview Terrace had been paid off in full by our father's 30 years of middle management labor, yet she spoke as if she had built every brick with her own manicured hands. She leaned against the sub-zero refrigerator and mocked the very military discipline that had kept me alive, calling it aggressive energy that poisoned the sacred vibes of her $2,000-a-week yoga business. To Monica, my habit of waking up at 0500 to perform my physical therapy exercises was an intrusion on her spiritual flow, and the silent way I moved through the house was portrayed as a threatening presence rather than a hard-learned survival instinct. She stood there, draped in a $120 silk kimono, lecturing me on peace and mindfulness while she lived off the equity of a property she didn't even legally own outright. I looked at Sophie hoping to see a spark of recognition or familial loyalty, but the girl just adjusted her noise-canceling AirPods and went back to scrolling, a byproduct of a household where empathy was something you performed for a camera lens rather than practiced with your own flesh and blood. Monica's voice rose a decibel higher as she explained that my trauma was a choice I was making to lower the collective frequency of the home, suggesting that if I just manifested harder, my nerve damage would simply evaporate. She dismissed my entire career as a primitive pursuit, a violent distraction from the true work of self-actualization, and in that moment, the contrast between the mud of the valley and the sterile luxury of this kitchen became an unbridgeable chasm. I realized then that my sister didn't just want my $1,200 in rent. She wanted to erase the parts of me that reminded her that the world wasn't just a series of curated aesthetic moments. I sat there in silence, my hands gripped tight beneath the counter to hide the tremors, listening to a woman who had never spent a night in the cold tell me that I was the one who didn't understand the value of a home. She had turned our parents' legacy into a transactional stage set, and I was just an unscripted extra ruining her perfect shot. As she took a delicate bite of her overpriced toast and checked her engagement metrics, I felt the last chord of sibling affection snap with a finality that echoed louder than any gunshot I had ever heard. This wasn't a home, it was a business, and I was being liquidated. But I am getting ahead of myself, because even then, amidst the smell of avocado and condescension, I knew that the truth about the deed and the debt was about to surface, and her high-vibrational sanctuary was built on a foundation of sand. Family isn't just a shared surname. It's the person who respects your scars instead of using them as a punchline for a spiritual ego trip. My name is Lauren Hale, and for the last 6 months, I have been a tenant in a home I actually own, paying $1,200 a month to a sister who turned my birthright into her personal ashram. The realization didn't hit me like a wave. It hit me like the blunt force of an IED, a sudden jarring shift in reality that left my ears ringing and my heart hammering against my ribs. I waited until I heard the distinct whirring hum of Monica's $60,000 midnight black Tesla Model Y backing out of the driveway, her tires crunching over the gravel as she headed toward her weekly Mercury retrograde alignment intensive, a class she charged $80 a head for while preaching about the flow of the universe. The house fell into a heavy, artificial silence, the kind that only exists in a place where every corner has been scrubbed of its soul to make room for aesthetic perfection. My knee ached with every step as I bypassed the pristine living room and climbed the narrow pull-down stairs into the attic, a space Monica hadn't bothered to renovate because it didn't fit the high-vibrational color palette of her Instagram feed. The air up there was thick with the scent of stagnant dust and the ghost of my father's old cedarwood cologne, a sharp contrast to the lavender-scented prison downstairs. I pushed aside a stack of discarded meditation cushions and a broken $300 juicer until I found it. A weathered cardboard box tucked into the furthest, darkest eave labeled junk. Do not open, in Monica's sharp, aggressive handwriting. Beneath a layer of expired Bed Bath & Beyond coupons from 2011 and a 2003 high school yearbook where her face had already been practiced into a mask of calculated serenity, I felt the crisp edge of a heavy manila envelope. The return address read Ford and Riley Law Offices, a prestigious firm on Liberty Street that specialized in estate planning and probate. My breath hitched in my throat as I slid the contents out, my hands shaking so violently that the paper rattled like dry leaves in a storm. It was a cover letter dated October 2018, and as my eyes scanned the legal jargon, the world tilted on its axis. The document explicitly named me, Lauren Hale, as the sole beneficiary of the property at 42 Pineview Terrace, citing my years of service and the fact that I had no other primary residence upon my discharge. Monica had intercepted my mail while I was recovering from my second reconstructive surgery at Walter Reed, ripping away the signature page and burying the truth beneath a pile of trash to play the role of a benevolent landlord. She had stood in this very house, looking me in the eye while I handed her my hard-earned disability checks, knowing full well that she was a squatter in my sanctuary. She had mocked my aggressive energy and charged me for the water I used to wash away the sweat of my nightmares, all while sitting on a secret that would have ended her lifestyle in a heartbeat. I sat there on the cold, unfinished plywood floor, the dust coating my lungs, clutching the proof of a betrayal that went deeper than any wound I had received in the field. But I am getting ahead of myself, because looking at that letter, I didn't feel the urge to scream. I felt a cold, tactical clarity wash over me. Monica had spent years curating a life based on manifesting truth and light, but she had built her entire empire on a foundation of theft and a stolen manila envelope. The $1,200 a month, the 3-gallon shower limit, the insults about my freeloading, it was all a projection of her own fraud. Family isn't supposed to be a battlefield, but as I tucked the envelope into my waistband and prepared to descend those attic stairs, I realized that the war I thought I had left behind in the mountains had followed me all the way to my own front door. Truth isn't just a vibration you manifest. It's a legal document that demands a reckoning. The tactical training of 15 years in the Army didn't just teach me how to survive an ambush, it taught me how to control the battlefield by maintaining a silence so absolute that the enemy never hears the pin drop. I didn't scream when I climbed down from that attic, nor did I confront Monica when she returned home smelling of expensive oud incense and boasting about how her third eye had finally opened during her alignment class. Instead, I moved with the practiced, quiet efficiency of a ghost, sliding into the driver's seat of my rusted but reliable 2014 Toyota Tacoma and heading straight toward Woodlawn Avenue to seek out the one person who could turn this paper trail into a weapon. The office of Ford and Riley was located in a restored Victorian building where the rent likely exceeded $5,000 a month. A place of dark wood and the hushed tones of old money that felt worlds away from the lavender-scented fraud my sister was running. I sat across from Linda Ford, my mother's longtime attorney and a woman who had known me since I was a scrawny teenager heading off to basic training. Linda didn't offer a forced spiritual smile. She offered a firm handshake and a look of profound professional disappointment when I laid the crumpled manila envelope on her mahogany desk. She confirmed the betrayal with a clinical precision that chilled my blood, explaining that Monica had actually picked up her copy of the finalized will in person 5 years ago, shortly after our mother's funeral. My sister hadn't just stumbled upon a mistake. She had actively suppressed the truth, knowing with 100% certainty that the house at 42 Pineview Terrace was legally mine and mine alone. Linda revealed a truth that hit me harder than any physical blow. Our mother had purposely left the property to me because she didn't trust Monica's chronic financial instability and the way she cycled through predatory business ventures and high-priced spiritual fads. My mother wanted the family legacy protected by what she called my capability and my sense of duty, qualities Monica had spent the last 6 months mocking as aggressive energy. It was a calculated move by a woman who saw her daughter's narcissism for exactly what it was and sought to build a fortress around the only child who understood the meaning of a permanent post. As Linda spoke, I realized that every dollar of that $1,200 I had Venmoed to my sister was essentially a theft from my own pocket, a tax on my own grief. I didn't let the anger boil over in that office. I funneled it into the logistics of the counteroffensive, paying the $150 fee for a certified, notarized copy of the original will with a sense of grim satisfaction. I tucked that heavy official document into the inner pocket of my waxed canvas jacket, feeling the weight of the gold seal against my ribs like a fresh magazine of ammunition. Monica thought she was playing landlord in a house of cards, but I was walking out of that office with the legal equivalent of a scorched earth policy. Family is supposed to be the one place where you don't have to watch your flank. But as I pulled out of the parking lot and headed back toward the suburban sanctuary that was legally my territory, I realized that the greatest betrayal doesn't come from a stranger in a distant land. It comes from the person who smiles at you while they pick your pocket and charge you for the privilege of standing on your own ground. The manifest truth Monica so often preached was finally coming for her, and it wasn't going to be a high-vibrational experience. For the next 7 days I operated under a veil of calculated submission, adopting the role of the perfect broken guest while I prepared a tactical strike that would dismantle Monica's comfortable delusion piece by piece. I moved through the house with a quiet precision, nodding when she lectured me about the negative frequency of my combat boots and paying my final $1,200 rent installment with a steady hand, all while my mind was calculating the exact cost of her betrayal. I didn't waste time on emotional outbursts. Instead, I took my 2014 Toyota Tacoma down to First National Bank and opened a high-yield savings account with a 4.5% APY, a fortress for the funds I was about to recover from the woman who had spent years bleeding me dry. While Monica was locked in her $3,200 home office filming Instagram stories about the spiritual necessity of letting go of toxic weight and purging negative influencers from one's life, I was quietly letting in a professional property appraiser I had hired for $500 to walk the grounds. He moved through the colonial-style hallways with a laser measure and a clipboard, noting the updated Carrara marble countertops and the high-end Sub-Zero appliances that Monica had installed using the equity she had essentially stolen from my name. The appraiser valued the home at exactly $792,000. A figure that felt like a secondary inheritance given the current volatility of the Connecticut real estate market. I didn't stop there. I sought out a top-tier real estate agent from a luxury firm in Greenwich who specialized in quick, high-value turnovers for clients who didn't have time for sentimental delays. We sat in my rusted truck at the end of the driveway, out of sight of Monica's Ring camera, as I signed a listing agreement to put 42 Pineview Terrace on the market for $815,000. Every time I heard Monica's voice through the vents, preaching to her 300,000 followers about the peace of an uncluttered soul, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction knowing that her entire stage set was about to be liquidated. She was so blinded by her own narcissism and her daily rituals of matcha whisking and sage burning that she never noticed the subtle shift in the atmosphere or the way I looked at the walls she thought she owned. I wasn't just planning a move. I was executing a strategic withdrawal from a toxic environment, ensuring that every cent of our parents' legacy would finally be redirected to the rightful beneficiary. I watched her through the kitchen window as she posed on her $100 cork mat in the backyard, her daughter Sophie nearby filming the perfect transition for a reel titled Living My Truth. And I realized that the truth was something Monica only liked when it was filtered and profitable. She had no idea that the very floorboards she stood upon were already being sold out from under her feet, or that the capability our mother had seen in me was currently being used to dismantle her fraudulent sanctuary with military-grade efficiency. I had spent 15 years defending territory for people I would never meet, but this was different. This was a domestic recovery mission, and I was going to ensure that by the time the dust settled, Monica would finally understand the real-world consequences of her spiritual theater. Family isn't a brand you build on someone else's sacrifice, and as I tucked my copy of the listing agreement into my tactical duffel, I knew the countdown to her awakening had already begun. The high-vibrational life she loved so much was about to hit the cold, hard reality of a sold sign and a legal eviction. The arrogance of my sister Monica reached a calculated, cruel peak during the final week of my occupation at 42 Pineview Terrace, a crescendo of petty tyranny that proved she viewed me not as a brother or a veteran, but as an inconvenient piece of furniture to be rearranged at her whim. I returned from a grueling 6-hour physical therapy session at the VA clinic to find that my $1,200 Tempur-Pedic memory foam mattress, the only thing providing relief for the nerve damage in my lower back, had been dragged out of my cramped room and dumped onto the cold, oil-stained concrete floor of the garage. Monica stood in the hallway with her arms crossed over her $90 Aloe yoga sweatshirt, informing me with a practiced, airy indifference that she had repurposed my 90-square-foot living space into a dedicated science project zone for her 17-year-old daughter Sophie. She claimed that Sophie's academic success required a high-vibrational environment free from my heavy, stagnant energy, and that since I was so used to sleeping in the dirt of foreign lands, the garage shouldn't pose a significant challenge to my hardened constitution. To further solidify her control over the domestic battlefield, Monica had spent $250 on a sleek, tamper-proof Honeywell digital thermostat cover, secured by a 4-digit passcode that she smugly refused to share with me. She set the temperature of the entire colonial-style house to a staggering 62 degrees Fahrenheit, a move she ironically justified as a soul-cleansing effort to save on utilities, the very same utilities I was already subsidizing with my mandatory $1,200 monthly Venmo payments. I found myself shivering in my own childhood home, the cold seeping into the titanium plates in my left tibia and causing a dull, throbbing ache that no amount of ibuprofen could mask. When I asked her to raise the temperature by just 3 degrees so I could regain feeling in my fingers, she let out a sharp, condescending laugh that echoed off the minimalist white walls. She told me to use my old army blankets and pointed toward the garage door, stating with a chilling finality that it was her house and her rules, oblivious to the fact that I had the notarized will tucked inside my jacket proving the exact opposite. I watched her adjust the lighting on her ring light for a scheduled webinar about the power of feminine leadership and the importance of setting boundaries, while I stood there in the freezing hallway, a ghost in a house I technically owned. She had managed to turn a place of sanctuary into a high-altitude training camp of psychological warfare, treating my 15 years of service as a punchline for her lectures on peace. Every time I shivered, she would offer a smug smile and a comment about how my military discipline should have taught me to transcend physical discomfort through sheer force of will. She was living in a fantasy world where she was the benevolent queen of a spiritual empire, but she failed to realize that the person she was pushing into the cold was the same person who had been trained to endure, observe, and strike back with overwhelming legal force. I took her advice and grabbed my heavy-duty wool army blankets from the garage, wrapping myself in the scratchy fabric as I sat on my displaced mattress, looking at the cracks in the concrete and the boxes of her discarded influencer gear. I didn't argue, I didn't plead, and I certainly didn't raise my voice. I simply allowed her to enjoy her final moments of absolute authority in a house that was rapidly being liquidated from her grasp. Family isn't about who holds the passcode to the thermostat or who can scream the loudest about their rules. It is about the person who stays when the truth finally burns through the lies. As the temperature in the house dropped even further, I felt a strange sense of warmth knowing that the legal fire I had started was about to turn Monica's 7,900-square-foot sanctuary into a memory she could never manifest back into existence. The tactical clock hit 1800 hours on a Saturday that smelled of roasted organic root vegetables and expensive, imported white truffles, marking the exact moment I chose for the final deconstruction of Monica's carefully curated empire. My sister had spent the entire afternoon preparing the dining room for what she called a gratitude circle, an exclusive 6-course vegan dinner for 12 of her wealthiest yoga clients, women who paid $400 an hour to hear her lecture them on the spiritual necessity of shedding toxic attachments. Monica floated through the colonial-style hallway in a $400 emerald green silk robe from La Perla, her skin glowing from a fresh oxygen facial, as she leaned over a centerpiece of white peonies to whisper a performance of manufactured martyrdom to her guests. I stood in the darkened garage, listening through the vents as she began her opening remarks, her voice dropping into that practiced, breathy register she used for her most expensive webinars. She spoke to the room about the heavy spiritual burden of supporting family members who refused to align with a higher vibration, painting a vivid, lying picture of her heroic efforts to house a broken, ungrateful soldier who was draining her financial and emotional resources. I didn't enter the room like a victim. I entered like a commanding officer reclaiming a seized outpost. I had spent an hour meticulously preparing my classy uniform, ensuring every ribbon from my 5 deployments was perfectly aligned and my brass was polished to a mirror shine that reflected the flickering candlelight of her $12 artisanal tapers. The heavy rhythmic thud of my spit-shined combat boots on the oak floorboards silenced the room instantly, cutting through the ambient sound of a $300 Tibetan singing bowl. The 12 guests, draped in designer linen and gold jewelry, froze with silver forks halfway to their mouths as I marched into the center of the dining room, clutching a stack of high-quality 8.5 by 11 photocopies of the legal truth Monica had tried to bury in the attic. The contrast was absolute. The sterile, perfumed luxury of her fraudulent life meeting the starched, ironclad reality of my 15 years of service. Monica's face went from a mask of serene enlightenment to a pale, twitching mess of panic as I began to distribute the notarized copies of our mother's 2018 will to every person at the table. I didn't raise my voice, but I used the same steady, unbreakable tone I had used to brief generals in the Green Zone, informing the gathered crowd that the woman they were praising for her charity was actually a squatter who had been illegally charging me $1,200 a month to live in a house I legally owned in full. I watched as the wealthy donors looked down at the legal seal of Ford and Riley law offices, their eyes widening as they read the specific clause naming me, Lauren Hale, as the sole beneficiary of 42 Pineview Terrace. Monica tried to let out a high-pitched, nervous laugh, claiming I was experiencing a post-traumatic episode, but the weight of the certified documents in their hands was a reality that no amount of spiritual gaslighting could manifest away. I stood at the head of the table, a $110 plate of vegan risotto sitting untouched before me, and looked my sister directly in her watering eyes. I told her and the room that since she loved boundaries and rules so much, she had exactly 72 hours to vacate my property before the sheriff arrived to enforce the eviction notice I had filed that morning. The silence that followed was heavy and cold, a vacuum that sucked the air out of her $400 silk robe and her $2,000 a week business. She wasn't a guru or a healer. She was a thief caught in the middle of a victory lap, and the gratitude she had been preaching was about to be replaced by the cold, hard logistics of a forced relocation. Family isn't a brand and blood isn't a license to steal from the people who bled for your freedom. As I turned on my heel to leave the room, the sound of my boots on the floor was the only thing that felt real in a house built on 5 years of stolen light. The air in the dining room of 42 Pineview Terrace, which usually carried the faint, expensive scent of Japanese hinoki incense, suddenly turned as cold and sharp as a mountain ridge in the Hindu Kush as I systematically dismantled my sister's carefully constructed reality. I did not use the weapon of raw emotion or the frantic energy of a victim seeking validation. Instead, I utilized the cold, undeniable weight of documented evidence, moving around the $3,000 reclaimed teak table with the steady, measured gait of a formal inspection. I placed a crisp, high-quality photocopy of the 2018 cover letter and the certified will from Ford and Riley law offices directly in front of each guest, making sure to linger for a second beside Monica's primary donor, a woman named Beverly who had recently funneled $10,000 into Monica's new mindfulness retreat. The room, which moments ago had been filled with the soft clinking of silver against fine bone china and the pretentious murmurs of the elite, fell into a vacuum of absolute silence that was broken only by the rhythmic rustle of paper. I stood at the head of the table, my class uniform a sharp midnight blue contrast to the soft linens and muted earth tones of the room, and I began to read aloud with the unwavering clarity of a mission briefing. My voice carried the weight of 15 years of command as I recited the specific section where our mother, a woman who had seen through Monica's narcissistic manipulations years ago, had explicitly stated that Monica had already received more than her fair share of the family resources through bailed-out debts and failed business ventures. The words echoed off the minimalist white walls. Monica has received enough. The house goes to Lauren in its entirety as a recognition of her service and as a permanent sanctuary. I watched the blood drain from Monica's face, her $400 silk robe suddenly looking like a cheap costume as her jaw tightened in a silent, desperate attempt to find a spiritual loophole that didn't exist. To ensure the execution was complete, I pulled a secondary stack of documents from my folder. A chronological record of every $1,200 Venmo transaction I had sent her since my return, each one clearly labeled as rent for the 90-square-foot guest room. I presented these receipts like a forensic accountant presenting a fraud case, showing her wealthiest clients exactly how their spiritual guru had been extorting a wounded veteran for the privilege of sleeping in a garage on her own legal property. The sound of 12 silver forks hitting the expensive plates was the only music I needed, a discordant symphony of shock that signaled the total collapse of her social and professional standing in the Greenwich community. Monica tried to protest, her hands trembling as she reached for a glass of vintage sparkling water. But there was no manifestation technique in the world that could erase the legal seals and the itemized proof of her larceny. She had spent months lecturing me on the importance of living in one's truth and shedding the weight of the past, but now that the truth was sitting on the table in black and white, she looked like she was drowning in the very vibrations she claimed to master. I didn't need to scream because the evidence spoke with a thunderous roar that silenced her excuses before they could even form on her lips. I stood there, a soldier who had survived 5 deployments only to find the most dangerous insurgent in my own dining room, and I watched the facade of her $2,000-a-week business crumble into dust. Family is supposed to be a bond of blood and trust, but as I looked at the circle of horrified faces and my sister's shaking frame, I realized that some bridges need to be burned to illuminate the path forward. This wasn't a dinner party anymore. It was a crime scene and I was the one holding the gavel. The fallout from my tactical disclosure was instantaneous and devastating. A structural collapse of a lifestyle built on a foundation of systematic theft and spiritual gaslighting that no amount of sage smudging could ever hope to repair. Monica's carefully curated Zen facade, a mask she had worn with the practiced precision of a high-stakes con artist, shattered in a single visceral heartbeat as she realized the airtight nature of the documents sitting on the table before her wealthiest patrons. The serene, breathy voice she used to command her $80 an hour meditation sessions was replaced by a jagged, screaming tantrum that echoed off the minimalist white walls of the dining room, a raw and ugly sound that stripped away the last of her manufactured enlightenment. Her guests, women who had once viewed her as a beacon of high-vibrational truth, looked at the certified will and the $1,200 Venmo receipts with a mixture of profound horror and clinical disgust at the 5-year betrayal of a disabled veteran. I stood at the head of the table in my classy uniform, a silent sentinel of cold reality, as 3 of her most prominent clients stood up in unison and canceled their $5,000 luxury retreats on the spot, their expensive silk wraps trailing behind them like flags of surrender as they fled the toxic epicenter of her house of cards. The social and financial capital Monica had spent years manifesting through the exploitation of our parents' legacy evaporated in the time it took for a silver fork to hit the floor, leaving her standing in her $400 lapula robe looking smaller and more frantic than I had ever seen her. Sophie, her 17-year-old daughter, stood paralyzed by the mahogany stairs, her iPhone forgotten in her hand as she stared at the sole beneficiary documents with a look of dawning, painful realization that the mother she idolized had been lying to her for half a decade. The girl's face was a map of shock, shifting from the practiced apathy of a teenager to the raw vulnerability of a child who just realized her entire world was funded by a fraud committed against her own flesh and blood. Monica tried to reach out to her, her voice cracking as she attempted to pivot back into a narrative of victimhood, but the evidence I had provided was a physical barrier that no emotional manipulation could bypass. The room smelled of expensive truffles and the bitter tang of a dying reputation as the last of the guests exited the heavy oak front door of 42 Pineview Terrace, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like the atmospheric pressure before a major storm. Monica's screaming subsided into a desperate, ragged sobbing, a performance that no longer had an audience to applaud its depth or sincerity. I didn't feel a surge of joy or a sense of petty triumph. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of a mission accomplished and a perimeter secured against a domestic insurgent who had mistaken my silence for weakness. My sister had spent months treating me like a stray animal in my own sanctuary, mocking my service and charging me for the very air I breathed. But as she collapsed into a chair surrounded by half-eaten vegan risotto, she finally understood the weight of the capability our mother had trusted me to wield. Family is not a brand you can manage with filters and carefully worded captions. It is a bond of loyalty that she had severed the moment she intercepted that manila envelope from Ford and Riley law offices in 2018. As I looked at the wreckage of her career and her vanity, I realized that the greatest casualties of this war were the years of trust she had incinerated for the sake of a $300 infrared sauna and a $60,000 Tesla. The house was finally quiet, the high-vibrational theater was over, and as the clock on the mantel ticked toward the end of her 72-hour window, the truth remained the only thing standing in the room. Dignity isn't something you manifest in a yoga studio. It is something you earn in the trenches, and mine was finally coming home to stay. I gave Monica exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises of 42 Pineview Terrace, a deadline I reinforced not with a text message or a spiritual plea, but with a formal notice served by a professional process server who handed her the papers while she was in the middle of a desperate, tear-streaked live stream to her dwindling followers. I stood on the gravel driveway, my hands tucked into the pockets of my field jacket, watching with a cold, tactical detachment as a $1,500 budget moving truck backed into the space where her $60,000 Tesla Model Y usually sat, its hydraulic brakes hissing like a serpent in the quiet suburban air. I didn't care about the bad vibes she claimed were vibrating through the floorboards or the spiritual trauma she insisted would manifest as chronic illness if she were forced to leave her sacred healing sanctuary. I watched as 3 local movers whom she likely couldn't afford to tip hauled out the $45 Himalayan salt lamps, the $300 infrared sauna, and the stacks of $100 cork yoga mats that had once been the props for her profitable charade. The house was being purged of its high-vibrational pretension, and for the first time in 5 years, the air at my childhood home felt like it belonged to the living rather than the grifters. Monica emerged from the front door one last time, her eyes rimmed with red and her $400 silk robe replaced by a stained gray tracksuit, attempting to launch a final, desperate guilt trip about the specter of homelessness and the cruelty of a sister who would cast her own flesh and blood into the street. She stood there, clutching a designer handbag that probably cost more than my first 3 months of rent, and accused me of being a heartless machine who had been broken by the military into someone who didn't understand the sanctity of family. I didn't raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply pulled a small leather-bound notebook from my pocket and pointed to the calculated figure of $72,000. I told her with a voice as steady as a marksman's breath that this was the estimated total of 5 years of stolen rental income, unauthorized utility charges she had forced me to subsidize, and the legal fees associated with reclaiming my property from her fraudulent grasp. I informed her that if she so much as looked back at the property line, I would file a civil suit for every cent of that back rent, a move that would effectively bankrupt her manifestation empire and leave her with nothing but the memory of her stolen luxury. The silence that followed was the most honest conversation we had shared since I returned from my 5th deployment, a moment where the weight of the legal consequences finally crushed the life out of her spiritual ego. She realized then that the capability our mother had seen in me wasn't just about my ability to follow orders, but my capacity to enforce justice when the people I loved chose to become my enemies. Sophie was already in the passenger seat of the moving truck, staring at the floorboards with a hollow expression that told me she was finally beginning to process the magnitude of her mother's deception. Monica didn't say another word. She just climbed into the cab of that rattling, diesel-fumed truck, and as the engine roared to life, I felt the final chord of our shared history snap with a sense of profound, quiet relief. Family isn't a bloodline that gives you a license to exploit the vulnerable. Family is the person who stands by the truth even when it burns the house down to the foundation. As the taillights of the moving truck faded into the distance, I walked back into my home, locked the Baldwin deadbolt and turned the thermostat up to 72 degrees, finally warm for the first time in a decade. The market in Greenwich, Connecticut, moved with a predatory speed that matched my own tactical efficiency, And within 96 hours of the listing going live on the Ms. 42 Pineview Terrace sold for $830,000 in a straight cash transaction that bypassed the bureaucratic delays of traditional financing. I stood in the empty foyer of the colonial-style house one last time, the orange glow of the $45 Himalayan salt lamps now a distant memory, and felt the weight of my parents' legacy settle into a clean, digital balance in my first national high-yield savings account. I didn't feel a sense of loss as the new owners, a young couple who looked at the house with the same hope my father once had, signed the closing documents. Instead, I felt the profound liberation of a soldier finally relieved of a post that had become a battlefield of betrayal. I took my half of the childhood memories, the small box of my father's medals and my mother's handwritten recipe books, and transitioned my life into a sleek 1,200-square-foot modern condo on the 24th floor of a glass-walled high-rise overlooking the city skyline. This new space is a fortress of minimalist clarity, featuring industrial polished concrete floors, floor-to-ceiling windows that capture the sunrise over the harbor, and a kitchen equipped with a professional-grade Jura Z10 espresso machine where the coffee is always real and the aroma is never tainted by the cloying scent of cheap sage or lavender fraud. The locks on this heavy steel door are mine alone, keyed to a biometric scanner that ensures the only energy entering this sanctuary is the one I choose to invite. A stark contrast to the 90-square-foot prison where my own sister once tried to ration my oxygen and water. Monica, meanwhile, has been forced into a jarring descent from her self-appointed throne of high-vibrational luxury, now residing in a cramped two-bedroom apartment situated directly above a noisy 24-hour Italian deli where the smell of cured meats and the rattle of delivery trucks provide a constant unzen soundtrack to her daily life. Her reputation as a spiritual guru vanished the moment the truth of her 5-year theft hit the mahogany table, and her client list has evaporated into a string of blocked numbers and demand letters for refunds on cancelled retreats. She spends her days trying to rebuild a brand on TikTok from a kitchen with peeling linoleum and a flickering fluorescent light, her manifestation speeches ringing hollow now that her biggest donor has filed a formal complaint with the Better Business Bureau. Sophie stays with me every other weekend in my guest suite, which is twice the size of the room Monica relegated me to, and we sit in the quiet of the city lights while she slowly unlearns the manipulative vocabulary of her mother's vanity. My name is Lauren Hale, and after 15 years of defending borders and 6 months of fighting for my own front door, I finally have a peace that wasn't manifested through a crystal or bought with a stolen inheritance. I realized as I watched the sunset reflect off the glass of my new home that family isn't the blood that flows through your veins, but the loyalty that remains when the stage lights are cut and the bank accounts are frozen. The $72,000 in back rent remains a legal tether I hold over Monica, a reminder that every action has a kinetic reaction and that the capability my mother trusted me with was never about my rank but about my character. I wake up at 0500 not because I am being watched or judged, but because the morning air belongs to me, and the silence of my condo is a symphony of victory that no spiritual gaslighter can ever disrupt again. Dignity is the only frequency that matters, and for the first time in my 42 years, I am tuned into a station that is crystal clear and entirely my own.